Have you ever sat down and fantasized about being a secret agent? When you did, what did that look like? Were you a suave and sexy spy with the allure of classic James Bond? Were you a grizzled shadow in the night that moves unseen like Sam Fisher? Were you using tools and gear that border on science fiction to get the job done like Ethan Hunt? Regardless of how your own fantasy plays out, what can't be denied is that people like spy thrillers. And those same people like to live out those fantasies in video games. In the mid-2000s, one video game developer was eager to step out from the shadows of IP projects and had been sitting on a pitch for this very idea. Meet the results of that pitch. Alpha Protocol. How did it come to be? How does it play today? Let's dig in. Obsidian Entertainment today is known for its work in creating the Outer Worlds, Pillars of Eternity, and of course, the legendary Fallout New Vegas. But back in 2005, they were best known as a relatively new company that took what other companies had done and built on the back of it. Building off BioWare's work on Knights of the Old Republic and Neverwinter Nights to deliver brilliant but flawed sequels to both games, with Knights of the Old Republic 2 in 2005 and Neverwinter Nights 2 in 2006. Building games like this wasn't even really a new thing for the newly formed Obsidian at the time, as the company was made up of the reformed employees of Black Isle Studios, whose first developed game had been Fallout 2, and every subsequent project had a firm base in Dungeons & Dragons, and the established canonical settings created by Wizards of the Coast. Obsidian had been sitting on this pitch waiting for the right time. An original spy thriller RPG. To them, it was a high-concept idea the team felt strongly about. A hybrid of a shooter and a role-playing game set in the modern era. RPGs to this point had a tendency to fully lean into either fantasy or sci-fi. Very little was set in a contemporary world. While Obsidian had been sitting on the pitch for some time, they were very eager to find a publisher who wanted to fund the game and get this made. This was the first truly original IP that they would develop. Note that I did not say own. More on that later. This desire ran all the way back to the Black Isle days. As I mentioned, every other game they had made to this point was a licensed property, an IP that did not truly belong to them, be it Dungeons & Dragons, Star Wars, or Fallout. After the critical and commercial success of Knights of the Old Republic 2, Sega came knocking, looking for Obsidian to make something for them. And the spy pitch? Well, that was enough for Sega. Embody James Bond. Be as ruthless as Jack Bauer. As resourceful as Michael Weston. Burn Notice was a thing back then. But the pitch was a 5 or 6 page document that didn't really go beyond that. This was unusual for the era. Pitches had a tendency to be much more in-depth, much more focused, much more of a full build-out of what the game would play like, what the big story beats were, and what the goalposts and target markets looked like. Somehow, despite the brief pitch that basically just went, spy thriller, Sega had cleared a 2.5-year development timeline for the game, but nobody was quite sure what they were making. Was it a stealth RPG? Was it an open-world spy thriller? Was it a linear action shooter? These were all ideas floated, and time was spent developing all of them at one stage or another in the early days of the project. At one point in the game's development, Alpha Protocol was a series of linear levels that you simply shot your way through because that's just what you did in a third-person shooter. Without clear direction, things seemed to just be getting made regardless of if they worked or were fun or even sustainable. Chase sequences were created and discarded. Early builds had a plethora of bland and frustrating minigames that didn't even feel like their intended task. At one point, reports indicate $500,000 was spent developing a quick-time event-heavy cinematic fight sequence on a plane that supposedly looked great, but was ultimately scrapped as it had no place in the final game as what the team actually needed to make came into focus. Sega had also contracted Obsidian to work on an RPG set in the Aliens universe, and had been working on a game known as Aliens Crucible during this time. It also struggled during early development, and Sega found themselves with 2 games they had funded Obsidian to make, and neither of them were going well. The axe fell on Aliens Crucible, and that made Obsidian truly aware of the precarious situation they found themselves in. With development seemingly in the wind, Chris Avallone and Chris Parker were brought in as leads on the project and had, as they describe it, a come-to-Jesus meeting to get the game focused. It worked. Sega's faith in the project was restored as the team settled into making a Jason Bourne-style thriller that allowed you to play your spy's personality in a variety of ways, eventually landing on the archetypes of the smooth-talking James Bond, the cold, calculating, mission-first Jason Bourne, or the intimidating Jack Bauer. Unfortunately, with the wasted time, the finally focused, leaner game had to cut or reduce some elements of the experience. Our hero, Michael Thornton, was originally supposed to have the option to exist as a girl as well, a Michelle Thornton, if you will. Cutting that character was a necessary evil to reduce the scope, crunch, and in the end reduce the voice acting budget by 60%, as dialogue wouldn't need to be recorded twice to cover the option. The other major cut ended up being something that severely hurt the actual gameplay of Alpha Protocol. AI is something absolutely critical to stealth games. While you don't have to play it that way, Alpha Protocol by nature had to be designed with stealth in mind. You may notice the AI is somewhat lacking during gameplay in the finished game, resulting in an AI that's overly aggressive and notices you when it shouldn't, or flat out doesn't notice anything while everyone around them dies. According to Parker, it wasn't always like this. They had put a strong AI opponent into place, but it was affecting the game's framerate, and performance was not up to par. Considering the performance in the final game, it must have been like watching a slideshow. Cuts to the AI were made to get performance to acceptable levels on consoles, and the project continued to move along, adding and subtracting incrementally along the way. Alpha Protocol was originally slated to release in October 2009, and Obsidian was able to make that date, albeit with a game that suffered from some bugs they were prepared to patch fixes for. However, October 2009 was not the best time to release a video game. Assassin's Creed 2, Left 4 Dead 2, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Uncharted 2, Borderlands, Bayonetta, and Dragon Age Origins. It was a crowded marketplace. Sega called an audible and made the decision to delay the game until May 27, 2010. For reasons unknown, but most likely budgetary reasons, almost the entirety of that time between October and May, Sega forbade Obsidian from working on patches to the game, forcing them to sit on a product they knew was rough and unable to fix it. The final game would receive one patch, but only fixed a select few critical bugs. That was all Obsidian was allowed to do with the game post-launch. Upon release, the game received less than stellar reviews, currently sitting in the low 60s on Metacritic, with critics praising the concepts and parts of the execution, but decrying large swaths of the game as buggy and poorly executed. A wonderful mess seemed to be the consensus. Between this and Sega being unhappy with the sales, the publisher refused to move forward with the sequel. Sega remained so unhappy with the product that in 2019, it vanished from all online storefronts, never to be seen again. Again, more on that later. However, as time has worn on, retrospectives have been kinder to the game, seeing the potential and seeing the positives in the execution of the now defunct game. So, who has it right? The critics of 2010, or the small group of fans dedicated to a game that Sega won't even acknowledge in 2023? To answer this, we're breaking out my hard copy for Xbox 360 and diving into the world of intrigue and espionage to find out for myself. Is Alpha Protocol a protocol worth executing? Let's find out.
That's all the search came back with. Sorry, Mike.
So, what exactly is a spy thriller RPG? Alpha Protocol in its final retail form settled on the answer being... Hang on, let me take a real deep breath here. a third-person action stealth shooter with RPG elements that encourages multiple playstyles and dialogue trees that influence the game in meaningful ways. Whew, that's a lot. So let's try and break this down. At its core, every single mission you go on with your personal Michael Thornton plays out as a third-person shooter. Depending on your playstyle, you can attempt to play it as a stealth game where enemies don't see you, and Michael slips in and out unseen. Or, you could play the game loud and go into each mission guns blazing. Obsidian did their absolute best to accommodate both styles of play, and anything in between. The RPG elements help give the game a unique feel from most shooters. As you sneak and kill and hack your way through the game's dozens of missions, you'll gain experience points and level up, allowing you to spend ability points on ways to beef up your spy. You can push for an assault Michael, specializing in assault weapons, or an explosives expert, a karate expert, or several other paths. Most approaches are at least somewhat viable, and the level design leaves you with a way to clear the missions with the skills available to each specialization. The only place where this falters is the balance. While there is usually a way through, I would not describe every route as equally viable, with the stealth players given a pretty severe advantage, and in later levels, outright breaking the game. Each set of weapons essentially represents a class in the game's RPG mechanics.
They all have their little quirks, but that's what makes them perfect for the job.
Pistols for stealth, shotguns for tankier players, SMGs for burst damage, and assault rifles for shooter fans. As you level these weapons, you get skills that you can use as perks when using them. The pistol skills are broken. Deeply broken at an almost hilarious level. The pistol skill allows you to pause time, line up 2 to 6 shots depending on your level, and just fire them all at once, allowing you to clear rooms of enemies in a single burst without having to fight anyone. This skill is critical for quickly clearing several of the game's truly awful boss fights. For everything else, there's a skill that literally renders you invisible to enemies, allowing you to simply walk up to every enemy in the game and silently kill them. At its final level, this skill allows you to run while remaining invisible, creating an absolute joke of combat situations where you can simply enter a room, turn invisible, and run around the room killing every single enemy without them ever seeing you. Other builds are viable, but none are as unbalanced as the stealth pistol build. That's not where the RPG elements end, but to get to those, we need to wade into the murky waters that is Alpha Protocol's story. Alpha Protocol casts you as the previously mentioned Michael Thornton, a bit of a blank slate with blank slate voice acting to match.
Considering the program's secret, I would have expected you to say traitor, unless you have insider knowledge.
Michael has been recruited to a government secret ops organization that, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist. I'll give you one guess as to the name of that organization. Michael has been recruited specifically to track down an organization in the Middle East that used what appears to be weapons built by a US manufacturer to shoot down a civilian plane, leading to heightened global tension. After being framed for an attack that was actually carried out by that arms manufacturer, you go rogue and are disavowed and find yourself on the run. Or are you? It's kinda unclear as you go on if you're still working for Alpha Protocol or not. You're a rogue agent, but everyone knows you're still on mission? It's very confusing. From there, it's a technobabble spy thriller of generic proportions, with a rotating cast of over-the-top stereotypes as you globetrot following leads to solve the dollar store brand Tom Clancy mystery. Why is this all important? Because these places, these people, and these story beats serve as the fodder for the rest of the game's RPG elements. Between every mission, Michael will return to one of several safe houses in the game. These safe houses serve as a hub between missions that allow you to gather intel for upcoming missions that can do things such as open new paths or create bonus objectives for cash rewards. Additionally, time spent here allows you to customize your weapons in a variety of ways, buy and sell gear to improve your skill set, or read up on the dossier of organizations and people you've encountered. Information is key in the world of being a spy, and Michael is supposed to be a master manipulator. Every person you meet in the game world has a dossier, and you can use that to read up on what they respect and how to act around them to get what you want. Alpha Protocol is full of conversations where you have to make snap decisions on how to treat people. And how you treat people can create allies or make enemies. It will influence the game and the way things can play out. Make a shaky alliance of convenience in Taiwan with a mobster by being blunt and to the point, and you can get them to send tainted drugs to Russia, which makes a later boss fight, the worst one in the game, easier and less annoying. Spare a known terrorist in exchange for information, and some enemies will turn into allies in later missions. Sweet talk certain people to get information about their past, and you can feed that to enemies later in the game to avoid or alter boss fights. Building on this, every decision you make must be a snap decision. The options for your responses come up while the person you're speaking to is talking, and you must select an option by the time they're done speaking. Unlike BioWare games of the era that let you sit there for literal hours staring into someone's eyes before making a choice, there's a real sense of urgency that Alpha Protocol forces upon you. And while the dialogue itself is nothing to write home about, the strongest emotion I felt playing this game was the tension and stress of navigating every conversation Michael has. It's a testament to Obsidian's devotion to the choices having meaning and how many different ways things can go. These elements aren't even just limited to conversations. Depending on your actions during missions, certain consequences can happen, which the game will detail for you after every mission. Killing indiscriminately can make an enemy out of people as they lose faith in you, while sneaking through silently can result in enemies having less security in later missions, as the enemy is not yet aware of your presence.
You're skilled at keeping a low profile.
In some potential allies' cases, you have to encourage a little bit of chaos, and you get a little bit of extremely helpful chaos in return. BioWare at the time was considered the king of decision-based RPGs, but Alpha Protocol frankly did it better. The decisions you made in games like Mass Effect had consequences, but only around the peripheries. And as the series wore on, these decisions got glossed over, with the same plot points and gameplay being covered with just slightly different dialogue and characters. Alpha Protocol treats every decision as important, and outlines the consequences to you. All roads still lead to the same finale, but the path to get there can feel dramatically different depending on how you play. I've been going on and on about it, but it truly is the game's biggest strength. Sadly, it doesn't quite pull off the ending, as the final cutscene in every variation of it pulls from the 2008 movie ending playbook and delivers a tonal knockout punch with what it does. Spoilers ahead, just take a look at this. I've seen 3 variations on this scene, and they all end like
We'll
this.
see. I bet there's 1 or 2 more in our future.
Smashed between all this outstanding role-playing are the actual missions, which swerve wildly from poorly designed corridor crawls to sprawling, non-linear infiltrations. You'll find yourself trying to deal with the game's mediocre stealth mechanics and piss-poor AI. Then, when that AI does something absurd and things inevitably break into a gunfight, you'll be dealing with this subpar gunplay that frequently reminds you that, despite playing like a third-person shooter, this is a shooter developed by a company used to making games with mechanics based in dice rolls. Even at the best of times when everything comes together, you'll be subjected frequently to Alpha Protocol's terrible minigames. From finding patterns and shifting key sequences to a terrible follow-the-line hacking minigame and a mediocre lockpicking game. These games are bad, and all indications is they were the survivors from the development that originally included several even worse ones. That's really the problem in the end with Alpha Protocol. There's some outstanding ideas in there that are even sometimes executed in an absolutely brilliant way. But something else is always getting in the way. Be it a bad minigame, poor level design, one of the multitude of immersion-ruining bugs or hard freezes the game is prone to. Well, that one probably would have ended poorly anyway. Or even just the game running out of frame rate in the low teens on a regular basis. there's almost always something Obsidian did to shoot themselves in the foot that prevents their game from reaching greatness. That didn't stop the game from selling halfway decently, moving 700,000 copies globally in its first month on store shelves, according to Sega. But it didn't even crack the top 20 in its first month on the US NPD charts, getting crushed and buried under the might of Red Dead Redemption and Super Mario Galaxy 2. Sega was content to leave it alone and simply put it on sale every time a Steam sale would come around, finally removing it from all digital marketplaces in 2019 when the music rights had expired and Sega did not want to renegotiate. I don't know what it costs to crack open old game code and update the music, but bigger games have certainly done it, with Grand Theft Auto 4 replacing significant chunks of its music library 10 years on. It would have been nice to see a bone thrown at the game. Here's where things get interesting. Obsidian, in their eagerness to develop the game, signed into their contract that Alpha Protocol and everything about it would be the IP of Sega. Thus, why they have never been able to pursue a sequel, let alone bug fix, and why Sega quietly removed the game from sale in 2019. However, Sega continued to maintain the rights to Alpha Protocol after that, meaning any future developments would have to go through them. That appears to have recently changed. In April 2021, it would appear Sega chose not to file paperwork to extend their copyright on Alpha Protocol, rendering the IP free from their approval process. Obsidian themselves are now deep in the development of several projects for Microsoft, such as The Outer Worlds 2. But it opens a narrow door for Obsidian to potentially revisit Alpha Protocol in the future. Despite the removal of the game from marketplaces, it's not an expensive game to find for consoles, and it's not a difficult game to make run on modern PCs, which, in the case of Alpha Protocol, is really the best way to experience the game. So, despite Sega's best efforts, if you want to see what the fuss is about from the dedicated fanbase, it's worth the price of admission. For myself, this was a fascinating experience. When I was younger, I was brought into a small studio to do observed play sessions of Alpha Protocol in a pre-alpha state. The game was an absolute mess at the time, with gameplay that would be best described as barely functional. But the dialogue system worked, and I remembered it being fascinating. Playing the game for this video is the first time I've revisited the game since that play session 15 years ago. And I can see what Obsidian wanted to do, and was nearly able to accomplish. With the rights back in the wild, I would love to see what could be done today to create the teased sequel,
like an Alpha Protocol,
and properly fulfill the ambition and concepts Obsidian reached for, but couldn't grasp in 2009, today.